In this second video of the 3 video series on the publication process, I do want to focus on the actual publishing process, right? What do you do to take your manuscript from, after having worked and worked and worked on it forever and ever and ever. And by the way, 10 to 20 revisions are not unusual. So just FYI. So if that's your experience, you're right there. If you had to do less than that, good for you. If you had to do more, that's also good. So again, it takes a lot, especially when you're writing with others, right? So that's a whole other level of complication than when you single author a paper. But again, mostly in the sciences, you're rarely single author a paper. Even in the social sciences and even in the humanities these days, collaboration on authoring papers is actually, I think it's a great way to write, but it brings some complications with it. Anyways, the publishing process. So you've written your manuscript, you've selected your journal, you're going to write. Next step is to your cover letter to the editor of the journal, editors, usually one editor. So the cover letter to the journal editor should include the following items. The title and type of your article. So is this a review article, a empirical article based on, whatever, however you want to describe your article, what type it is, particularly if there are different types that being published in that particular journal. So remember back to the first module when I reviewed certain genres with you, common genres in publications. Are you writing a research report? Are you writing an opinion? Are you writing an actual research article? So again, make it clear in your cover letter. You want to include the names of all the authors. And in addition to that, and I think I forgot to put this on the slide, you do want to identify what is called the corresponding author. And the corresponding author is the person to whom all communication is addressed in terms of the publication process, what happens after the manuscript has been received. So who takes care of the quote-unquote correspondence, right? You want to also include a short paragraph that briefly explains why your article fits into the journal. That's really helpful to the editor. So the less work they have to do in figuring that out, if you can help them out with that, it's a really nice gesture. You also want to include some assurance that your work is original and has not been published elsewhere, or parts of it hasn't been published elsewhere. You also want to clearly indicate that there are no conflict of interest, right? So just a phrase on that is really useful. And I'm going to link to a website, I think it's from Editage. It's one of these commercial editing, proofreading, writing services for authors in academia. Again, have some useful free material on there as well. They have a wonderful overview of how to structure your cover letter as well. Plus, Jürgen Fischer's blog that you have read parts of also gives you some guidance on that. So there is a lot of guidance on that out there that follows pretty much what I'm outlining here, more or less. You also want to include a list of potential reviewers. Now, it doesn't mean that the editor is going to use those, but you want to include a list of potential reviewers whom you feel, or you want to include a list of those people whom you feel can judge your work fairly and adequately because they're experts. Now, there might not be folks that the editor has in mind, and it's okay, but it can be sometimes helpful if they're like, oh, these people, they're already on my review board anyway, so let me send it out to them. So again, it's helpful to the editor. In the same vein, you can also list name of potential reviewers who should not review your work. And this is particularly common in the STEM sciences, and I think more and more so in the humanities and social sciences as well. If you're not sure if that's a good idea to do, you can always check with the editor before you submit. Hey, would you like me to give you a list of who should review my work or not? They also might specify that, and by they I mean the journal, but also specify that in its guidelines. But this is fairly common practice because sometimes there are reviewers who might not look favorably at your work because of some competition issues between different labs and so on. So, and I'll talk about this in a couple of minutes as well. The review process can at times get, I'm just going to say that it can get very nasty. And some reviewers, I've seen some reviewers' comments that I thought were absolutely unprofessional, personally. Most reviewers do a wonderful job, but some reviewers really, include some language in their reviews and some judgment that I think is very unfair. If you don't think the work is worthy to be published, you can say so, but you can say so in a way that is not, that is still polite and professional. Let me leave it at that. So again, I go back to the cover letter. Those are some of the items you want to include in your cover letter. Now let's talk about journal articles in the sense of where what happens when you start submitting them. So you want to make sure you submit only to one journal at a time. Can I say this one more time? Only one journal. If you do this, if you submit, let's say you submit to 2 journals at the same time, same manuscript, chances are that the reviewers for each of those journals are, if not identical, then maybe one is identical. And this has happened to colleagues of mine who I've talked to. They've received the same manuscript from 2 different editors, and they're like, wait a minute, I'm just reviewing this for this other journal. And people talk. Editors talk to each other, reviewers talk to each other. That is not a good reputation you want to have as somebody who submits their work to multiple journals. It's really a big no-no. And usually reviewers and editors try to do their best with a quick turnaround time, so no need to submit it to more than one journal at a time. I said this earlier, think about at least 2 to 3 journals to which you can submit your work. So have that always ready, sometimes even more than that. So there's 4 possible responses that you can get when you submit, and some of them are nicer than others. So let me start off with the one that is very rare and very unlikely, and that is accept as is. This means you send in your manuscript, the reviewers read it, the editor gets back to you and says, this is wonderful, I'm going to publish it, next week, next month, the way it is. This happens very, very rarely. It has happened to me once, and only because we were asked to submit our articles to a journal as part of a panel that we were giving at a conference. And it was one of my first publishing experiences. So I thought, oh, this is easy. And then I quickly realized, no, this is not the norm. And again, it was a special case because we were solicited, the work was solicited in a sense by the journal editor. He really wanted to publish our panel as one of the volumes actually for that particular journal as a special view, as a special topic issue. So in that case, I think I only had to make like 3 or 4 grammatical sentence level corrections. That was it. And I think add a reference, but that was it. A colleague of mine, Henry Silverman, whose work we're going to look at in the next video in the School of Medicine here at UMB, this happened to him also as the first. He's a medical doctor, and he submitted a case report to a journal, and it was published as is. So a case report or case study, especially case reports, that is not uncommon that they are published as is, but with journal articles that were based on, a rigorous methodology, usually you have to do some revision. So accept it is very rare. If it happens to you, congratulations. If it never happens to you, that is the norm. Now the second, so this is the first, the ideal response that we would love to have, hard that, but very rarely. Accept with revisions is still great, and I'm going to try to draw a thumbs up here. Okay, my drawing is not so great. This is wonderful. This means that the editor gets back to you and says, here are the 2 reviewers, the reviewers' comments, maybe some of the editor's comments. We would like you to change these things, address these, send it back, and then we'll publish it. This is fantastic because you're guaranteed a publication, but you will have to do some work with addressing the reviewers' comments. So this is great. The third response, or third level response, is resubmit with revisions, which is not too bad either. So I'm going to go to smiley face here, right? Because this means that the journal, so this is probably what the editor will say to you. We like your work. Here are the reviewers' comments. We would love you to, honor these revisions, revise accordingly. You can then resubmit to us, and I will send it out most likely to review, maybe to the same reviewers, maybe to some other reviewers. And if they don't see any major issues, we'll then publish it, right? So this is often an issue like, hey, we found that you need to maybe clarify more your data analysis. We can't guarantee your publication, but please resubmit once you make those revisions. This is great. Resubmit with revisions is a wonderful verdict, and you definitely want to take them up on that. Do the revisions, send it in. You might get published, you might not, but you're much closer to publication than the next, which is, the most devastating verdict that you'll get, and you'll get it probably a lot, and that's okay. It happens a lot that the journals say, thank you for submitting, here are some comments, we're not interested, right? At least you get some comments, so that's something, and then you can revise accordingly, depending on how much you agree with the reviewers' revision suggestions for revision, and then you send it to another journal. So reject, gets a frowny face, and maybe some tears. right? So that's unfortunate, but it is totally the norm, right? So I do want to normalize the reject verdict as something that all writers experience in academia, all of us, plenty of times. So it's really important for you to hear that this is very, very normal. If you've published before, you probably have gone through this process before. And just because one journal doesn't want your work doesn't mean that some other journal don't. Which leads me to this next slide. Why do papers get rejected? And I've taken this slide from a presentation by Stephen Miles, who is a PhD or MD. I think he might have both degrees. The link to his PowerPoint is down here, which is going to be hard for you to access, but I will add the link to the supplemental course materials in the module as well, so if you want to take a look at it. But here's this wonderful slide that he kind of reviews based on the study he's done or somebody else has done on why do papers get rejected. So they're factors based on the paper. And if you look, mostly it's because it's poorly written. And grumpy reviewers are not friendly, and sometimes their feedback can be pretty harsh. But I'll say something about this soon in a couple of slides. But mostly it's because it's poorly written, right? So that's the factors based on the paper. So it behooves us all to really spend a lot of time in revision and getting feedback on this, right? And only 16% based on the study is really because the methods are flawed. So paper factors are really, if a paper gets rejected based on something that happens in the paper, it's usually because it's poorly written. The good news is about this, you can definitely remedy this, right? Because you're now becoming brilliant writers, and you already are, so that's going to work in your favor. Now, journal factors. These are really kind of outside of your control. And 22% of rejections based on journal factors are because the submitted manuscript does not fit the audience or the issue. Doesn't mean your work isn't great, doesn't mean it's well executed, doesn't mean it's well written, it just doesn't fit, right? So a lot of rejects are because of this. And that doesn't mean that your work isn't well, it just means that the editor and the reviewers don't agree that your work is a good fit with the journal. And so you'll find another fit. Okay? So just wanted to give you that perspective. Here are some, just an example of some submission criteria. Let me click on this one briefly just to show you. This is from the public health journal right here. So it tells, just to give you an idea what it looks like, how to submit the manuscript. There's a call for papers, right? Remember I mentioned this earlier, special sections. Here is special issues. Here is one on particular issue. And the deadline is December 15, 2019. It also gives you information how to become a peer reviewer, editorial policies. You can click here, and you can click on a couple of different things here. It'll give you some information. And just to show you, here's open access. So $2,500 per article is the cost for open access in this journal. So I said several $1,000s. There you see it. So I'm going to add these 3 links in the supplemental course materials as well if you want to take a look at the Journal of Cardiology, and then outside most of your disciplines, this is in my discipline, the American Historical Review, just for information. So let's talk about the review process. So I mentioned this already earlier. The editor or editors of a journal select articles to be sent out for review. They then assign usually 2 reviewers to the manuscript. That's the usual number. Sometimes you have 3 if the editor feels. Well, let me put it this way. This can happen if one reviewer says, this is brilliant, we should publish it with these changes, and the other said, this is the worst article I've ever read, absolutely, we should never publish it. The editor then might send it out to a 3rd person to kind of as a tiebreaker, because they might be like, what the heck is going on? That's a huge disagreement. Or the editor might step in themselves and say yes, no, or whatever. And this could even happen if the reviewers disagree. They think, I don't think this should be published. And the editor might be, you know what, I think it should be published, so let's do that. So reviewers tend to be authors who have usually published in their journal and are familiar with the topic of the submitted manuscript, so they're experts in the field. So just to give you an idea of who these people are. Reviewers provide written feedback on the manuscript, and often it can be very detailed. It also can be very short. So it all depends on the reviewer. Sometimes I've seen just 2 or 3 comments. Sometimes I've seen 10 pages of comments. So you'll never know what you're going to get. And as I said, an editor might also provide feedback and also serve as sort of a tiebreaker in a situation where one person says, yes, should be published, no, shouldn't be published. So let's talk about I want to talk to you about this blind peer review process. So the blind peer review process has been the gold standard of our review process for a long, long time. And the traditional one, the double-blind review, means that the reviewers don't know who the author or the authors are, and the author doesn't know who the reviewers are. This can be challenging to do at times because you have to remove any kind of identifying information, of course the names, but also within the text. So particularly if the study is based on data from somebody's institution, it's going to be challenging to double blind that. So more often you'll have a single blind review where the reviewers know, or at least they can probably figure out the identity of the author or the authors, but the authors again don't know who the reviewers are. So this is, those are usually the standards of that blind peer review process. And single blind review is easy to guarantee, even though the editors might not share the name of the authors, right? They only get the manuscript with the names removed. But if the text refers to like previously published work by the authors, the reviewers can quickly figure out who that is. So, and even if all of the identity has been hidden in a double blind review process, sometimes depending on the field, you can, if you're the reviewer, you still have an idea who writes this work because you might be so familiar with your colleagues and other folks in the field. And recently, there is a tendency for open review, which I find very refreshing, brings some challenges with it. Everyone knows who the author and the reviewers are, so there's no blinding at all. And sometimes reviewers' names are even published with the article. So this is an interesting development, and I'm curious to see what's going to happen with this over the next years. I'm going to include some links to this particular conversation about open review as well in the supplemental course material, because it's really interesting to kind of follow that. So make sure you get back to that whenever you have a chance. Over the winter break, I guess. But or copy it and save it in your links or as a PDF file somewhere if you're interested in reading more about this. So responding to reviewers, just want to walk through that briefly, and then in the next video I'm going to take you to some sample responses by an author to a reviewer. My colleague Henry Silverman. So the motto for when you're responding to reviewers should, to a certain extent, be the reviewer is always right. Sort of. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the reviewer says, and I'll talk about this in just a second. But in general, I would suggest when you get reviews back, you can take a look at it right away, but before you respond, take at least a few days. Sometimes the wording of reviewers' comments can come across as very harsh, even though they don't mean it. And sometimes reviewers are, very unpleasant in the way they evaluate your work. And it's extremely unpleasant to read that. And, almost on the side of it can traumatize you. So that's why responding to that, before you respond to it, let a few days slide. To take some deep breaths, meditate, be good to yourself. But make sure that when if you decide, depending on if you got the resubmit with revision or publish with revision, make sure you respond to every comment by each reviewer. That is absolutely necessary. And in your comments, no matter how unpleasant the other person has expressed themselves, be polite, polite, polite. You can disagree with what they say. You don't have to agree with every suggestion. You just have to make sure that you justify why you don't agree or why you disagree, and so on. And I'll show you some examples in the next video. Ultimately, what your comments need to show to the editor, because the editor is really your audience here, you want to show your willingness to address feedback even if you don't agree. You'll have to always address it.